And without further ado, I think I'd like to move directly into the panel, particularly since we have an extremely limited time. Maybe I'd like each of the panelists to make something like 5 minutes of opening introductory remarks, generally following the format of the previous panel, commenting on particularly on what the SDGs mean in your own country, how you are using and engaging with the UN around that, and the broader roles not only of government but of non-governmental actors in that. And if we could start with the Ambassador of Finland, I'd like to do that. I'll skip the biographic information in the interest of saving time. You can find that in the program. Madam Ambassador.
Thank you very much, and thank you everybody for coming, and thank you for the invitation. The theme is extremely important, and I can say for Finland and Finns that we have thought about sustainable development already before there was a UN effort on this issue, and that is a good starting point actually for implementing the Agenda 2030. I would like to tell you a little bit about how we approach the implementation in Finland. And in this kind of an issue, it is extremely important, as you alluded to, that there is a very robust governmental approach, but that there is also a whole of society involvement and participation. And that is exactly what we are doing in Finland. So the implementation is, in a sense, twofold. We have something called a National Commission for Sustainable Development, and then there is a governmental approach to this issue. Now, as far as the government is concerned, after the UN approved the Agenda 2030, there was very quickly a quick kick-off event already in November 2015, which was important because it indicated that the government is fully committed to not only approving the SDGs Agenda 2030, but also moving with the implementation. We also participated in the voluntary national review of the high-level political forum on sustainable development in 2016. So we wanted to be there early on for this review process. Then very quickly, the government reported on plans to implement. And in February this year, the government gave a very concrete and extensive report on implementation. Now it's called report, but it is actually a plan of implementation. And it's a very interesting document because it's a very concrete agenda for the government to both proceed with legislation, but also with other kinds of policy initiatives. In the governmental report or the plan for implementation, there are two focus areas. There is something called carbon neutral and resource-wise Finland, which encompasses a lot of different actions. The other focus area is non-discriminating, equal and competent Finland. Again, a very broad target or objective. In addition to these two focus areas, the governmental implementation plan identifies policy principles for implementation, and they are long-term action and transformation. Long-term, we have to be here in the long term. The second one is policy coherence and global partnership. And the third one is ownership and participation. Now, going to the second track, so to say, the whole of society approach. We were one of the first countries to establish something called National Commission on Sustainable Development. That happened already in 1993, 1 year after the Rio conference. And this is an interesting body. The chairman is the Prime Minister, but the participation is from a wide range of stakeholders. The Prime Minister's office offers the secretariat for this commission, and the task of the commission is really to make sure that all national work, policy work that we do has integrated the Agenda 2030 in its own work. Just to indicate the broad membership of the Commission, there are several governmental ministries, there are representatives from the Parliament, municipalities, extremely important, regions, trade unions, church, science and research organization, and many others. There's also something called an expert panel on sustainable development, which sort of keeps a very critical eye on the actual implementation. And I would also like to mention that we have established a youth group to particularly focus on the participation of young people in this whole work. And we had quite a robust participation from this youth group actually in the UN General Assembly in the meetings related to sustainable development. Now, what is interesting about this commission is that it was very instrumental in launching a society's commitment to sustainable development. So basically, again, not only relying on the governmental programs, but we also wanted the society at large to focus on what the society, not only the government, but everybody wants to do in order to promote the goals of Agenda 2030. And the result was this commitment by the whole of society. And that commitment has formulated the targets for sustainable development a bit differently from the 17 goals, but each of the targets that they have identified is connected to one or several SDGs. And the beautiful idea about this commitment of the whole of society is that it has actually called for concrete commitments from whoever, individual citizens, municipalities, schools, trade unions, and so on. And there are already something like 300 commitments, very concrete commitments on how that particular group aims to promote the SDGs. So to wrap up, I think in a society like Finland, it is, since there is already a very robust governmental commitment to the SDGs, but that has to be also still, I think, put in concrete form as far as legal action is concerned, legislative action, and all kinds of legislative actions. But it is extremely important to remember that this process is both, it's two-way. You have to have robust governmental action, but there has to be a very strong ownership and participation by ordinary people and their communities. Thank you.
very much. And I'm delighted to see that the ambassador has the finished report right here with us. We can hear now the perspectives from Afghanistan.
Thank you very much. I would like to start with the note that Afghanistan started the MDGs in the first place late. We in 2001, we started this whole process of reconstruction and rebuilding. And it was sort of starting everything from scratch on all sides. So until the end of 2014, we were not able to complete the MDGs. We were way behind. And when it came to the SDGs, still we are in the phase of alignment. We started the nationalization after we committed, and until July 2017, we were doing the nationalization. And until the December of 2017, we will be doing the alignment, and we will start the implementation in 2018, January 2018. I would like to touch base briefly on the challenges. Obviously, they are security, they are also cultural, they are weak institutions that we are working hard on. So that does not mean that we have not made progress. We have made a lot of progress compared to what we started in 2001, but still compare us with other countries, we need a lot of more work. So after we committed, in 2015 we created this committee of for SDGs, and the Ministry of Economy is has the secretariat of this. And this is a high-level committee. The president and the CEO attend those meetings. It has also technical committees and working groups. Those are working on this. We also, one of the problems with our nationalization and alignment, and then in the end of the day funding them, is our sources of funding. They are not only Afghan, so we rely on international assistance. 90% of our budget comes from international assistance. So we also have to do a lot of work both home and with the donors so that we can align with these SDGs well. I may return to the, I will also mention that we did our volunteer report in July 2017, and in that it was not a report, I would say, but just our vision and our plans, what we are going to do, because we still have not finalized the alignment phase. I want to return to the challenges. They are, I will start with the example of polio. Afghanistan was polio-free 3 years before, but polio returned to Afghanistan because of the problems. Those are not only Afghan, but those are regional. Migrants, the refugees returning from Pakistan, they bring the polio back with them. Or there are areas which are very insecure and vaccination does not take place because of security reasons. And also cultural reasons, people do not allow their children to be vaccinated. So we do not, so that what we thought was a success story we had to start it again. So this is just an example. Now we have also a problem with the data collecting and processing, and also like we have a serious problem with statistics, and that we are working on with the international community. We are asking for more assistance to build our capacity on those areas. And our own security, also it is one of the goals of the SDGs. We think we will achieve at least a peace deal in the very near future or the coming years. We are very much optimistic, especially after this new commitment by our international partners. And when it comes to institutions, we have started a self-reliance agenda, a reforms agenda, which the President is working very hard on that. We are taking very strong measures against corruption. Deputy minister level people have been tried and brought to justice. And we are also going through a generational transition in Afghanistan. That means that newly educated people with holding degrees, graduate degrees, are returning and taking the lead in the institutions in Afghanistan. So that is our way forward in strengthening our institutions. I will leave it to you. It does not take much time, but we can return to it.
Thank you very much. And if we could move now back to the Nordic world and hear perspectives from Sweden.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. Sweden, just like Finland, is a small country far up in Northern Europe, where it's cold and dark for half of the year at least. So we're humbly aware that we can't change the world on our own, not even our own society. So Swedes are firm believer in a strong multilateral system, and especially a strong multilateral system with a positive agenda for change. So it's been easy for Sweden to embrace the 2030 agenda, both with a national and an international agenda. And we realized that we must start at home and lead by example. And our Prime Minister is very engaged, both in the national and the international work. So we have a system that is similar to the Finnish one, where we have formed a multi-stakeholder national committee that is composed of both CSOs, municipalities, private sector, trade unions, and academia. And they have, together with the government, produced a draft proposal for a national implementation plan. And the government hopes to take a decision on that early next year. And all ministers in the government are in charge of implementing the Agenda 2030 within their own areas. And we have two ministers that are in charge for coordination of the work. The Minister for Public Administration is in charge of the national implementation, and the Minister for International Development Cooperation is in charge for the international work. So the vision of Sweden, we have a couple of areas that we focus on and where special initiatives have been taken. Sweden aims to be one of the first fossil-free developed nation countries in the world, and has set a goal that by 2045 will be a net zero greenhouse gas emissions country. Our Prime Minister has launched an initiative that's called the Global Deal. It's an initiative where employers, unions, and governments together should work to work for more inclusive growth and development. And we work closely with the OECD and ILO to further this initiative to make globalization positive for everyone. Sweden also is a firm believer in gender equality. We have a feminist government that works with a feminist foreign policy. And we also have focused on SDG 14. And we held, together with Fiji, an international conference in New York in June to promote sustainable oceans. Sweden is also very engaged in development assistance, and since 2006 we have given 1% of GDP to development assistance, and we're the 6th largest donor of development aid in the world. We're also engaged in UN reform, and our Prime Minister is engaged in a high-level group with Prime Ministers or Presidents from, for example, Brazil, Colombia, Liberia, South Africa, and Germany, and some more countries, to continuously focus the attention on the implementation of Agenda 2030, and to follow up on its goals. I also want to mention the private sector, which we see has a key role in innovation and financing and finding new creative ways of implementing the agenda. The government supports companies and the work of companies to progress when it comes to corporate social responsibility. And one issue that we have also focused a lot on is sustainable procurement, where we have a new legislation since the 1st of January this year that is very focused on sustainable procurement and anti-corruption. We also, to really make the implementation concrete, Statistics Sweden, which is the national statistic agency, has adapted its indicators to Agenda 2030 and is measuring progress on the implementation in Sweden. And so far, it says that Sweden has delivered on 49 of the indicators and we live up to, so far, 20% of the goals that are set for Agenda 2030. And I'll stay there for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think I'll skip the stage of a discussion among the panelists in the interest of opening up for a wider dialogue with the participants here. And please raise your hand if you've got a question, identify yourself, and we'll take several questions and then move back to the panel.
Maybe in the meantime I can add something so that there will be time for thinking about questions. And I wanted to add to what Emma said. It's also interesting how the Nordic countries sort of act on these issues also together. I mean, we always compare with each other's, which is already a very good boost for doing better, but we also take joint initiatives. So for instance, in May this year, the Nordic Prime Ministers made an initiative which is called Nordic Solutions to Global Challenges, and it's all about sustainable development. And I think this is also something important, that you can have groups of countries which put forward ideas, work together. Another very important affiliation for Finland in all matters related to sustainable development is the European Union, because quite a lot of the legislation actually is done at the European level. So that is very important to I think, note.
Several questions. Start with a young lady in the third row, fourth row.
Hi, thank you. I'm Kathy Bolognese. I'm a strategic communications consultant, and I'm also on the UNA Sustainable Development Committee. I just wanted to follow up on the comments about Sweden and the business community there. You already have a strong sustainable culture there in your businesses and state-owned companies, but I'm under the impression that there's really even a bigger push for more stronger innovation and setting sort of global standards for that. Can you talk a little bit more about what kinds of initiatives, policies, or programs you're putting in place to take it to an even higher level?
Let's collect several questions.
Good morning. My name is Cecilia Guerrero. I'm part of the committee as well. I wanted to follow up on the gender parity and to hear your comments on what do you think are the major challenges, especially for developing countries, and to achieve that in terms of educational levels, knowing that a female educated has a major impact in the society. Thank you.
Thank you. Why don't we pick up on those questions first? Would you like to comment on that, Anna?
Yes. Yeah, I think private sector is the key issue if we really want to implement Agenda 2030. And I think sustainable procurement is really something that is a key issue. And that's one of the areas where we have worked and focused a lot in Sweden. So we have a new agency that is following up on procurement issues and supporting all levels of government that are engaged in sustainable procurement. And the legislation that was adopted 1st of January this year is very much focused on sustainable procurement. So I think that is one where the government tries to interact with private sector. The government is also engaged in encouraging standards and labeling, sustainable labeling for products to lower emissions or energy use or organic food, for example, to encourage companies to improve their processes. Because one of the challenges we still have in Sweden is, of course, that Swedes' level of consumption is still not sustainable. Being a developed country, we also use up a lot of resources. So that's one of the challenges that we really need to focus on, and to ensure that we have sustainable production and consumption patterns in Sweden. We really need the support of the private sector to come up with better technologies, more sustainable ways of both producing and consuming. So I think that is a key issue as well.
Would others care to comment on these?
I can comment on the second question.
Please.
Yeah, so we have that problem very seriously, and we are trying to tackle with it. Right now, 40% of our children, kids going to school are girls. So in 2001, we had none going to school. So that's a big achievement we are making. But we are doing it through programs, sort of, I would call them like positive I would not name that, but we are trying to prioritize them in our schools, in our government institutions, and through programs such as giving more food so that the families send their children, especially their female children, to school. The problem is more cultural than religious, but in Afghanistan, because religion does not ban or stop females from going to school. But the cultural sensitivities are that a woman going out of home in remote areas in Afghanistan, that is not culturally acceptable. It has come that in the very remote villages, in the very traditional and cultural villages, they consider it a shame for their female students to come out. So that has changed so much during these 17 years of our struggle, that we now have schools in most, female schools in most of our districts, but there are still districts which, because of security reasons, we somehow have made hostels for them in the city centers for the female students from the villages who come to the city centers and then study in those hostels. So culturally, the biggest one, but that is being held by the security, bad security in some of the areas. That is challenging to us. So we also believe that it is connected with other goals that is mostly development and health, and because if you bring good services, good governance to the district, to the villages, if you bring them good health, if you bring them good awareness, so those dynamics then change, because we have experienced that. So we know how to penetrate into those areas and villages, and we are working on that.
I think, at least for Finland, the experience is that if there is one key factor behind what we have achieved, it's gender equality. And that is why we keep it very high on our domestic agenda still, because it's a continuous battle, it's a moving target to have full gender equality. And but we also focus on it very much in our development cooperation. And I would like to mention something that I think is very important. It's the concrete work that is being done, but also the, public figures, important public figures talking about issues like gender equality. So that is why, for instance, campaigns such as He for She is very important. And I was so proud about, for instance, my president. This time it's a man. The last one was a woman, but he's taking up this gender equality issue. He's one of the He for She leaders who really keeps this issue very high on the agenda. So now in New York, during the UN General Assembly, it was a big thing. I mean, it was not a side issue. It was really a big thing for the leaders to talk about gender equality. About the private sector, I fully agree with Emma that it's very important. And you have different levels there. You have the governmental level, which gives maybe some legislative sort of framework for the companies to do better in this respect, and maybe some guidelines. But then you have the sort of the public expectation from the companies. And here again, I would like to mention this commitment of the society that we have in Finland. Companies can get a lot of goodwill if they make that kind of a commitment to the sustainable development, for instance, as far as their emissions are concerned, or energy consumption, or whatever. And I think that's also one way to, not only to force the companies or encourage from top to bottom, but also to give the companies a chance to respond to a public expectation that they do better in the as far as the SDGs are concerned. Thank you.
I come back also because I didn't reply to the gender equality question, and for me as a feminist, it's really inspiring to work for a feminist government, and the Swedish government declared that in 2014 when it just had won the elections, and it's been a hard work to try to understand what is feminist foreign policy, for example, what is being a feminist government, and it's been a working process where all ministries and every person at the foreign ministry as well has been forced to try to work through everything we work with through the lens of gender equality. And we focus on 3 R's, resources, representation, and rights of women and girls. And I think education, as you mentioned, is a key thing, both in development but also for developed countries to focus on. And we try to look through all our development assistance programs through a development lens, and education is of course one of the key issues to work with to improve gender equality.
Thank you very much. You can add on that from an Afghan perspective?
I touched base on the education, but I wanted to also talk about what we are doing to give them an equal share in our government, in the institutions. So 28% of our MPs are female, which is more than the United States. And we have our first lady is playing a very important role in especially women issues, but overall development and human rights and all social issues. So she is very active. And compared to the times when a first lady working on these issues, nobody would think about that. We have ambassadors, deputy ministers, and even in our High Peace Council, which was thought to be mainly a subject, an issue of the males. But now we have women in, and we are giving them grounds so that they play a role in peace.
Thank you very much. I will pose a question now to the panel myself. Going back to the observations of Tony Pippa, we hear that one of the challenges is inclusion, ensuring that the agenda is really universal and applicable to all. That leads inevitably to the question of social and ethnic minorities and how they are integrated and taken into account in the SDG planning for implementation and follow-through. And I'd like to hear from the panel about their observations on how this dimension is being addressed in your countries. A very difficult and challenging problem. We'll hear first from Tim.
Well, first of all, this whole theme is, as I said, one of the, when I explained how the government approaches the SDGs, I mentioned that there are two focus areas. And the second focus area is non-discriminating, equal and competent Finland. So that already tells you, and you can, if you are interested, look at the report. There are several points of action there, how at the government wants to make sure that there is full inclusiveness. And this is certainly a problem. It's not only about minorities, it's also about some of the majorities who are not very active. And so the objective is there, and the fact that the objective of inclusion is there also is an indication that it is a challenge. Again, I would like to go back to this idea that we are implementing sort of parallel to the governmental approach, the challenge that is out there for the whole of society to make commitments. And then we come to actors which already as such include a broader broader range of population. If we are talking about government, it's by definition mainly, I mean, it's active people. But when we are talking, for instance, about municipalities or trade unions or church, it's they reach a much broader population. And when they get together, like they have done in Finland, to talk about what our community, our group could do to make sure that our country and the world is on the path to sustainable development, I think it's we already reach much more people. But it is a continuous challenge, and I'm afraid our societies, at least in Finland, I have the feeling that on the other hand you have huge opportunities, for instance, through social media, but social media. But at the same time, the social media makes people more passive. It's sort of you easily just, stay in the social media and you don't go out and take part in some activities. So it's a continuous challenge.
Thank you. And the others, would you care?
So in our constitution, we have named each and every ethnic group that they are equal citizens of Afghanistan. And in our national anthem, each and every ethnicity has their name, so that they have that feeling of ownership. And whenever there is a national anthem playing, they see themselves. This was one of the ways we try to give that feeling of ownership to the people. But as you rightly mentioned, it is not only a matter of minority, but sometimes majority. You focus too much on the issues that you forget about the mainstream. But our problem is security also. Because of that, we care about the life of each and every Afghan, because we see that the life of every Afghan is at stake. So when it comes to a life, everybody forgets about other things. So one of the good things in Afghanistan is that though there are those discussions between the big ethnicities, but we never have that polarization or that sense of where we hear that the ethnic minorities feel sidelined or isolated. For example, we have the Sikh and Hindu minorities on the Eid. The first people the president meet are those communities, though it is not their religious festival, but to give them the feeling that there are quotas for them in the government, and they are even prioritized in certain programs. So these are some of the ways we try to include them.
If we look at the challenges in implementing the Agenda 2030 in Sweden, apart from sustainable production and consumption patterns that I talked about previously, I think inclusion is the other second big issue. So in the National Action Plan that will come, I'm sure that there will be concrete actions to target marginalized groups. For example, further the inclusion of LGBTI people, how Sweden should better integrate the large population of newly arrived migrants will be a big issue for us to tackle. Also, better inclusion of people with disabilities, and the continuous work with gender equality, for example, to close the wage gap between men and women in Sweden. And looking at the international perspective, I think the initiative that our Prime Minister has launched, the Global Deal, is an effort to also prevent globalization from backfiring, to make employers and trade unions and governments work closer together to ensure that the economic growth we have is inclusive and sustainable, which will benefit both employers, companies for growth, and for the employees.
Thank you. I think we have time for a few more questions.
Actually, over time.
We're running over time. Okay, well then what I will do is just take a few minutes to try to offer a few synthesis comments. First of all, I think we sense from all of the observations, starting with Tony Pippa through all of the speakers, that progress is indeed possible. Progress is being made in many countries, in many different ways. We heard from Barbados, we heard from Costa Rica, now we hear for 3 other countries in this panel. And yet, the progress is not universal, and this is the formidable challenge that we face in all. And it's very striking to hear from our Afghan colleague about the measures being taken with the Hindu populations in Afghanistan, people actually working at it. Look at the challenges that exist here. Even in the city, it's quite obvious that there's a serious problem of inclusion among the black and the non-black populations in D.C. Another thing that is very striking about the whole set of discussions is that the global goals in their early discussion, particularly in the stage of the Millennium Development Goals, were north-south in their orientation. It's very clear, not only from the design, but from the presentations by each of the panelists, that the SDG agenda is no longer north-south, that it is truly universal, and that it is an agenda for every country and for every community, to be applied flexibly, to be sure, but relevant to all. We had very interesting examples of SDG implementation from each of the countries. We had slightly different views on the critical importance of central government engagement from the panelists. There was clearly a lot of emphasis on that. From the observations of Tony Pippa, it's apparent that at least in this country, serious progress can be made and is being made in some groups and organizations without a significant lead at the federal government level. That's not to suggest it's not desirable, but it does show that no one needs to be intimidated by the position of national authorities. We can all pursue the agenda ourselves. Finally, I think it's clear that the goals will not be achieved by traditional foreign aid, will not be achieved by traditional financial mechanisms. These are necessary but not sufficient conditions for achievement of the goals. Governments must engage, the business sector must engage, and it's been very interesting to hear the comments from each country about how the business sector is engaging, even in this country with reference to Citi and Merck, where there isn't a governmental promotion of business engagement, that this is actually happening. NGOs of all sorts, philanthropists. I think probably many of you heard of the philanthropy platform, which is interestingly enough a partnership between foundations and the UN Development Program. So implementation of the goals is a responsibility of all institutions as well as all people. We depend very much on the UN to provide information, to provide support, but the agenda, if it is to be meaningful, must be an agenda for all, an agenda that is ours. Thank you very much. I hope I've been brief enough for you, Patrick.
Thank you to our panel. I just have a few closing remarks, and so if you guys want to take your seats, thank you so much. Thank you again to Mr. Elmendorf for synthesizing today's conversation on the Sustainable Development Goals. Would like to just do a few thank yous. First of all, to the UNA-NCA staff for their continued support in helping to make this event a true success. Also, a special thanks to our co-sponsor, the Georgetown International Relations Club, for helping us secure the space at the Healy Family Student Center here at Georgetown University. To Nexus Media for providing some online coverage. Want to thank our friends from the Environmental Futures Initiative for helping to promote our event. A special thank you to my fellow committee members. There's so many of you guys, I won't be able to list all your names, but I appreciate your help today in helping to plan this event. And of course, to our moderators and speakers today for facilitating this very important conversation. So some parting thoughts for you guys. Today, as we close the second anniversary of the adoption of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, I believe we have learned much about the marked progress throughout the globe starting with the Caribbean and Latin America through the lenses of Ambassador Hart and Makaya, of Barbados and Costa Rica, to the continuing challenges by countries faced in Central Asia through the lenses of our Afghan representative, as well as the leading steps being taken in Northern Europe by Ambassador Kauppi of Finland and Ms. Emma Nilsson of the Swedish Embassy, to further champion for real, lasting, and effective results on the implementation of the SDGs. So today we have marked this anniversary with many invaluable global perspectives. More importantly than this progress report is where do we go from here? I believe by electing to become more engaged on the SDGs here and now, we are committing ourselves to helping do our part in meeting these global goals. Many of us probably were sitting here at the beginning thinking about how far removed we are from decision makers through our government leaders. But the reality is, we all have a choice and a voice here today. We have an opportunity to make a difference. By attending and participating local forums such as this one this morning, we are empowering ourselves with the necessary tools and framework to help take on the work that is shared by all citizens of this planet. Today, I challenge you to make the commitment by getting involved with the UN Association if you aren't already. Please consider joining our chapter here in Washington, D.C. to become more engaged in our shared quest to champion for these 17 goals for sustainable development. As the chair of the Sustainable Development Committee, I am truly humbled to be leading such a dynamic and passionate group of individuals from virtually all walks of life, who are dedicated to making a positive impact here in our local communities of Northern Virginia, the state of Maryland, and the District of Columbia. We strive to develop programs that actively assist and support strong US-UN partnership through increased public knowledge, advocacy, and community engagement. Furthermore, our chapter is composed of many programmatic committees that address relevant topics such as human rights, international law, and peace and security. Today, I invite you to join my committee as we work to address and resolve these issues. Granted, the answers to these critical global issues won't come overnight, but with your help and the help of our local community, I know that we can do our part for the successful implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you so much.